It's always fun to talk about one of your passions, and certainly gardening is one of mine. I'm going to go down here and share my screen, and we'll talk about my evolution and projects as a gardener. So can everybody see, I hope, transformational landscaping? So I put this Google Earth picture of my property up to show that I do not have a traditional home site in Kansas, although a lot of Kansas, well, Kansas is a prairie state. As you can see, I have tons of trees, which means that I have quite a bit of shade. That is a unique problem for a lot of people in our area. They don't have a lot of shade to deal with, but I have just a few spots where I have quality sun all the time, and it makes a big impact on how I garden. So I'm going to go through a few slides to talk about how long I've been on this property and where we started. We've been residents of Wichita since 1976. We fell in love with the area along the Little Arkansas River north of town and found a property to buy in 1980. The house wasn't much. It had been built in 1926. We wound up ultimately actually tearing it down. This is what we started with. I also want to point out that all except 4 pictures in this presentation, outside of pictures of books and other websites, were taken on this property. So you get an idea of what I have been able to do or not do. So it took us 10 years to build our house. And in the building process, we had to cut down some trees. So I really did create some sun. And during that 10-year period of time, my wife and I had children. We planted things that I loved. Like a lot of gardeners, we have favorite plants. Mine included things like azaleas, roses, holly, plants that I was familiar with from the East Coast. They did not do well in Kansas. And in fact, over the next 10 years, virtually everything I planted perished. In this set of pictures, you'll see the leftmost plant with the pretty pink bloom on it. That's a rhododendron. It is not native to Kansas. You rarely find it outside of very wet environments and in shade. There are a few of these that have survived in Wichita. This plant is been in my garden about 15 years. It has bloomed one time. I keep it now to remind me that you ought to garden where you live and not necessarily where you don't. The center picture at the top with the yellow daylilies, we'll talk about that as we go on. Early on, you can see how much sun there is on this row of daylilies along the driveway. In the lower right-hand corner, I have a row of oak leaf hydrangeas that replaced about, on 2 occasions, 10 different azaleas that I managed to kill in a very short period of time. The oak leaf hydrangeas have been just rock solid plants. They're extraordinarily durable, take no care. In 2000, 2010, I began to covet my neighbors' gardens. These 2 pictures, the one on the left was taken by a neighbor's house who was also a master gardener. This was Bill and Kathy Etheridge. And the house with the waterfall is Mike and Susan Kantz. Mike is president of the the Wichita Pond Society. And they are extraordinarily great gardeners and have done a masterful job with their landscapes. I wish I could say the same. 2010 to 2018, we're talking 30 years of transition, you can see how my daylilies are now in more shade. And I think what this points out is that over time, your landscape is not static, it's going to grow. Trees grow, trees die, plants have a lifespan. The grapevines that at one time are planted on an arbor against that fence, who thrived in the sun, 2 to 3 of them have died because they get no sun now because of my neighbor's trees. So this is all a process. And over this process, I guess I learned a lot from different frustrations that I had. And as I aged and maybe had a little less energy for gardening, and I learned more about the impact that we've had on our environment, I began to develop a vision for what I wanted my landscape to be. This period of creating a vision, I think, is one of the central events that has to happen for anybody that wants to design and create their own landscape. I really had to have a very strong vision for what I wanted in order to do the research and the work to create my landscape. And here were the 5 criteria that I had when as I began my vision. Number 1, I wanted to shrink the lawn. I have a lot of lawn in 2 acres that serves no real useful purpose. I don't have children that run and play on it anymore. It's extraordinarily resource intensive to fertilize and keep it green and keep the weeds out of it. I wanted to remove the invasive species that we have introduced over the years in Kansas that compete for space and nutrients and outcompete some of our native plants. I wanted to plant keystone genera, which would allow me to maximize the benefit to the wildlife. Being on the river, we see an awful lot of wildlife. We're talking pollinators, turkeys, caterpillars. On the lower right-hand picture, you see a monarch butterfly caterpillar. The American goldfinch is feeding on one of my favorite native plants that we'll talk about a little later. I also recognize that in order to reduce the maintenance on my landscape, that I had to be extraordinarily generous with plantings. Over the years, when you're planting a bed that is 20 feet wide and 50 feet long, you just aren't going to make an impact with 6 plants. It takes a lot of plants. And then I also wanted to plant for specialist pollinators. And by that, I mean, if you take the swallowtail caterpillar, there are probably about 6 or 7 species of the swallowtail that will exist in Kansas, and each one of them takes a different host plant to feed its larva. So if you do not have a persimmon tree close, or you do not have a pawpaw tree, if you do not have some of these specialist plants, these butterflies, which you'll see the eastern swallowtail black form in the upper left picture, they have no place to lay their eggs and to nurture and grow their young, which then become adult caterpillars later on. So I look for having a few of these plants that are unique and only used by 1 or 2 varieties to simply try to fill out my landscape. And I want to stop here and make a point that this is my vision. This may not be your vision, and I'm not here to promote necessarily a all native, small lawn, low maintenance, pollinator friendly, wildlife friendly landscape. There are too many copies of Better Homes and Garden and Southern Living and Fine Gardening out there that have created visions of what we think is a perfect landscape. And I'm not going to critique your vision. I just think that in order to have a landscape that you enjoy, you have to have a vision. And without that vision, I don't think you'll ever achieve your own personal design, which basically will give you the greatest amount of satisfaction in your living space on this planet. So over the years, I did an awful lot of research. And there is a wealth of information available in the local area to learn about just what works well. I like native plants in addition to the ecological benefits that they provide, but native plants have adapted to this area and are easier to grow with less input. Native plants are less work because they've already figured out how to survive 100-degree summers and 10 below winters, dry periods and wet periods. And it's a different group of plants than what you would see in Kansas City or promoted from St. Louis or from nurseries in Washington State that want to sell you not non-native necessarily, but non-adapted to your climate. That going into plants that thrive in Kansas has saved me a ton of work. And at this point in time, I'd rather sit and enjoy my landscape than constantly work at it. So the research is where I really had to concentrate on bringing my vision to life. I had to spend a lot of time going and looking at plants and landscapes, and I had to visit them during every season. Fortunately, we are blessed with some really high quality gardens that we can visit within a 30-minute drive of downtown Wichita. Botanica is a world-class garden. And I've visited gardens in St. Louis and Nashville and Atlanta, and Botanica stands right up there with them all. Dick Arboretum in Heston, that's a little bit more than 30 minutes away, but it really is a gem that has an arboretum with native plants adapted to our area. So you can go up there and see plant materials and design concepts that really do fit a native prairie landscape. The Extension Service puts on a garden tour every year. It's a great, everyone ought to take the time, pay the $10, go view these gardens. These homeowners have done remarkable jobs. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of knocked out the tour last year and maybe even this year, but it'll be back, and it's worth your time to see what these homeowners have done. And down south of town in Belle Plaine is Bartlett Arboretum, which was started probably almost 100 years ago and has been lovingly restored and protected now by the current owner and volunteers. And it's just a marvelous place to go. It's a little unique in that they have varieties that have been growing down there for close to 100 years that we don't see anywhere else in our area. The one that comes to mind most is the loblolly pine. Pines are notoriously difficult to grow long term in our area. Most of them probably have a lifespan of about 40 years, and Bartlett has got some that are state champion trees that are 80, 90 years old. So go out and look at plants and notice that I don't want to disparage nurseries because they are an important part of providing plant material. But what you see in a nursery, they got in at the beginning of the season and it'll be gone by the end of the season. And so you really don't get a chance to look at how does a plant look over a period of time? What is that 5-gallon shrub going to look like after it's been in the ground for 20 years? You're going to see these mature gardens brings a brand new perspective to the design and the vision that you're trying to create. And by the way, it's a great way to spend a day or an afternoon. Oh, so, they say the devil's in the detail. And my gardening up until I had this vision was to go to a nursery, see a bunch of plants I liked on the shelf and go, God, I like that. So I think I'll buy that. I know I can find a place for it when I get it home. When I did, I found a place to plant it, but it it resulted in a very uncoordinated landscape. So now what I had to do was I had to say, okay, now that I have a vision, I need an honest to goodness landscape plan. Now, I could have done all of this if I had a bucket full of money, and I could have gone to any number of landscape designers, and they could have done a plan for me. But I didn't have a bucket full of money, and I kind of liked the research that I was doing. Everybody is capable of doing this. This plan that you see on the right here, I just had some graph paper, a large graph paper. It was probably 20 inches by 30 inches that I got at one of the office supply stores. And I had a 100-foot tape measure. And I went out there and I marked all of my trees. I marked all of the structural plants that I was going to leave. And then I began to take the research that I had done on plants that I wanted, and I began to try to fit them in to this plan. And this was probably the best thing that I've ever done as a gardener because I was used to, like I say, just kind of winging it. So now that I had a plan, it was time to start. The front of my house looked out on Sullivan Road, and it had this lovely row of spirea that had been planted probably in the 40s. They were big. They were gorgeous in the springtime for all of about 2 weeks. And other than that, they served no useful purpose. I dug them up and put them in the mulch pile. The plant on the lower right is a burning bush. Now, this burning bush was a very mature burning bush. It was probably 10 to 15 feet tall. It was gorgeous in the fall, but it's invasive. I pulled up burning bush seedlings all over the yard all the time. And it's known as invasive, and so it had to go. I'm still trying to get rid of creeping Euonymus. It's a non-native vine that just wants to take over. And another invasive plant that I constantly pull out because our neighborhood is just loaded with them are Japanese bush honeysuckle. But it was an easy job. I have good soil, didn't take long. It was the first thing I had to do. And so part of my plan also, I just want to touch base on this for a second, included cessation of bloom. So in my plan, I had to have plant not only plants that had a shade tolerance, but would fit my budget, but would also bloom from spring to fall. And what you see on this page is pretty much a representation of early spring blooming columbine in the center lower picture, And on the far right is aster, which I had never grown before, and found out to be that it would just hum with bees and pollinators in the fall. Everyone ought to have one. It's one of the last plants that are available to carry over our insect population into the new year. The other thing that I really wanted were perennials. I didn't want to have to spend the time or the money or the work of planting a lot of annuals every year. I don't have anything against annuals. There are some lovely annuals. I'm just particularly lazy, I guess. And I was also mostly concerned with natives versus nativar. And a nativar is a native plant that has been selected for particular characteristics and then essentially hybridized. Technically, it is a native plant, but a lot of pollinators simply do not recognize it because its form has changed a lot. Now, because I garden with a lot of trees, I am not a typical prairie where I'm looking solely for perennial plants or wildflowers. I needed structure in the form of shrubs. Again, everything I have to plant has to have shade tolerance. Shrubs are probably the most expensive plant material that you can buy. Many shrubs have been hybridized. The center picture, you see that red, very interesting looking flower. That's the common name would be Carolina allspice or sweet shrub. The burgundy flower is its native form. They also sell a variety that is actually white called Venus. White was a sport that was found somewhere, and it's now been isolated and sold under that trade name. But I had to work with materials that would help me create a foundation. The plant on the lower left is not a native. It's one of the few non-native plants that I have. That is a Chinese dogwood, not particularly invasive, doesn't provide much in the way of benefit to wildlife, but it is so elegantly beautiful in the springtime that I just couldn't dig it up. So I may be passionate, but I'm not obsessive compulsive most of the time. I'm particularly good at hardscape. I find that I can grow rocks as well as anybody. And so when I had my plan, and if we go back to the plan, this will take a minute to scroll through because these pictures are slow to load. You can see that I have these edges created, and everything on the street side and the edge side of these edges is flower beds, and the center is lawn that I'll have left. And I wanted to find some way to separate lawn from my garden. The solution was, for me, about 6,000 pounds of rock, which I was able to create an edge with. The other thing that I wanted to do is I needed mulch to create a good growing medium or to keep weeds down, which I found out mulch really doesn't keep weeds down. Weeding keeps weeds down, but it keeps the soil cooler and it retains moisture. And the city was glad to bring me 2 dump truck loads of mulch because they create it every day and need to get rid of it. This is a spreadsheet that I created regarding my planting list. I have the scientific name, common name, the source that I got my plants from, then height, width, light, where I planted it and when. I planted a lot of plants I propagated from seeds. Most of the plant material itself, I was able to convince a wholesale nursery that I should be able to buy from them. And so I was able to get small landscape plugs. I could get about 5 times as many landscape plugs as one would cost, which really helped stretch my budget. It's worth it if you're a shopper. The fact that I started Icy Trees and had a federal ID number and a state tax certificate helped a lot. And so then I began my work. You can see how I've started my edging. I started my planting because, of course, I was impatient. I had to plant. In the center picture, you'll see a lot of the seeds that I started that I'm out hardening off. Beginning to move mulch to create my walkways. And so I'm into my second year. And I've had some wins and I've had some losses during this period of time. One, it now takes me 15 minutes to mow my front yard compared to the hour it took before. I planted around 800 plants the first year, and that only covered about half of my front yard. It takes a lot of plants or a lot of time to cover as much square footage as I had. I planted 14 new trees and 30 new shrubs. I had over 30 years had lost quite a few trees, and it was time to replace them. I created a nursery bed and was able to buy what they call liners, or what you can get from the Forest Service if you qualify, that are basically 2-year-old seedlings of these shrubs. And so I did a really good job of finding the plant material that I needed within my budget. The one thing I hadn't counted on was that even native plants during the period of establishment need water. It's just too hot, it's too dry, it's too windy to set new plants out and not have adequate water. Now, I have plants that have come up volunteer from seed that were native and never need any water. But when you take a plant and you disrupt its root ball and you put it in the ground, you've got to water. So I had to put in a sprinkler system just to maintain what I had. I don't think I'll have to use it very extensively after I get about 2 years worth of growth going. I was a failure at design. So far, my planting design does not appear as if it's going to evolve into what I envisioned. And it's mostly the way I chose my plants and the method or the design that I planted them in the areas that I had chosen. This was a long-term project for me. When I started it, I knew that it would take anywhere from 3 to 4 years before I had something that I was willing to tell a friend to drive by to look at. And you can see that in this lower right-hand corner. I planted a native redwood is the taller tree, and I got a weeping form of it. And then in front of it are some red twig dogwoods, which do okay here. But those are spaced for what would be a pretty normal full-size spacing when they are, say, 7 or 8 years old. But right now, they don't make much of an impact. And I had to be willing to live with that sparseness for a period of time. The other thing I discovered is that weeds grow exponentially in the sunshine. When I took that spirea hedge down, I didn't realize that it shaded fully 30 feet from the street on past those large oak trees that you see there, and nothing would grow. Well, the minute I took them out, the sun hit it, weeds were cheering, and that's been a challenge. So I've learned a lot in the process, but I've also made quite a bit of progress. And I think that I've found my solution to my design dilemma. There is a great Dutch landscaper by the name of Piet Oudolf, and he's done a lot of really great work in the United States. He's part of the new perennial movement, and he uses nothing but perennials. The top picture on the right is one of his gardens that he installed, probably in the Midwest, somewhere in Ohio. And his design style is one where he looks at the form of a plant in all stages of the season and has, with the knowledge of what they're going to look like and his creativity, really creates an attractive landscape that doesn't look like a weed patch. Now, I couldn't figure out how to do that, and the more I researched and worked at it, there was a doctor by the name of Deborah Chudd who retired, loved Piet Oudolf's work, couldn't afford to hire him to design her house, and decided she'd figure out how to do it on her own. And that's her yard on the bottom. And if my yard looked that well, I'd be doing cartwheels in 5 years. So I found some people to emulate and to help me understand my design dilemmas. And so I really have high hopes that going forward, I'll be able to create something that I really like. And you'll see some website addresses here. If you, and later on, I'll tell you how to get those so that you don't have to worry about writing them down. I told Savannah that I would break and let questions come in, but obviously I didn't do that. But I do have time for questions now, Savannah. It's a good spot to talk about it if you'd like.
Sure. There was just one question so far. It was, what was the name of the plant that you said bloomed a lot? And it was near the beginning of your presentation,
Okay.
if you know which one they were
I
referring
know
to.
exactly which
Okay.
one it is. It's the one that had the bird in it and the butterflies. Is that correct? It is purple coneflower, otherwise known as Echinacea purpurea, is the scientific name. It is native. It grows prolifically. It blooms from, I'm going to say, the end of April to the, I still have some blooming right now, but it's pretty much at the end of its season. So that's my favorite. My second favorite is probably the blue aster that comes on in the fall. It won't bloom until about maybe another week or two. It'll come into bloom, and then it'll stay in bloom until almost the end of October. So I hope that answered that question.
Yeah. There was someone who just said, can you repeat the name of the first one, please? I think you said blue.
Oh, the purple coneflower?
Purple. Thank you. Purple coneflower.
Purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. And they're selling an inordinate number of hybridized plants. You'll find them in orange, you'll find them in raspberry, you'll find them in about 6 or 7 colors. If you want a variety of colors, by all means, look at what they have. I will tell you that the native variety, the standard purple coneflower, which is what I have, is just an outstanding plant for wildlife and for long-term bloom. It's a little bit bigger than some of the other plants that are out there. Mine grow to about 3 feet tall, but I have them planted in my front garden right outside my front window where my office is, and I have a constant parade of pollinators and bumblebees and purple finch and yellow goldfinch most of the year.
Great. The next question someone's asked is, how do you tell the native plants apart from the nativars when shopping?
You have to shop at a reputable dealer. Now, if Dick Arboretum in Heston has 2 plant sales each year, and they will tell you which ones are the true native species and which ones are the nativar, because they do carry some of those. If you go to a nursery like, and I know we're not supposed to use names, but put me in jail, Hillside or Treetop, they will also be able to tell you, but they will also carry many more of what we consider to be the nativars. And so you have to be careful and you have to do your research. I was looking at a Burpee catalog in preparation for the first presentation of this, and I saw 2 pages of purple coneflowers, and plastered across both pages were native plants. And they were native only in the sense that their parents were born here. And since then, they had been hybridized to the point that a bumblebee wouldn't recognize them. And the other thing that helps too is that the Kansas Extension Service has a lot of information on this. Matt McKernan, Matthew, who introduced me, is extraordinarily knowledgeable about this. And it's our mission to share that information. And so I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to Matthew and say, help me here. Where are good sources? Let me try to go back and see if I've got. So there are some great mail order nurseries. If I can back up. Nope. I guess I just backed all the way out. So let me do this. Bear with me for just a minute. I think we still have some decent amount of time left. So if you would like to have information about the sources that I've used in this presentation, by all means, if you'll send me an email, I'll get that slide back up here in a minute. This is a great resource. The Kansas Native Plant Society. Tremendous amount of help, extensive plant lists. Some mail order nurseries, Prairie Nursery, Prairie Moon Nursery. The Mount Cuba Center in Ohio has a lot of information about the distinction between the native and the nativars, and they're doing quite a bit of research about how pollinators and wildlife respond to these nativars. Remember that the native species, the butterflies and the wildlife have had tens of thousands of years to specialize in using these plants. And you can't take a cultivar and introduce it and in 2 years expect these organisms to just automatically adapt and choose something new. So it does take a little work. Um, the horticultural industry, though, has been a little disingenuous with natives because they understood during the low-fat diet craze that they could advertise something fat-free and load it with sugar and make you think it was beneficial for you. Same thing with natives. Natives has become an extraordinarily popular marketing tool, and you really have to do due diligence to know if you're, and deal with reputable suppliers. I wish it were easier, but we're not going to regulate, we're not going to put a label on them that says, hey, this is the real deal, and everything else has been propagated and hybridized to give you something that's pretty. It's probably a long-winded explanation, but you just have to work at it.
Another person wanted to know, can you order plants in a large quantity, say from treetop early in the year, or do you just buy what is available at the time?
Well, if you get to them early enough, I have had the nurseries order things from me because they have good connections with some of the wholesale nurseries like Monrovia or Greenleaf. They put in orders 2 or 3 times during each season. And if you talk to one of the managers there, you can get them to order plants from you for you. So it's kind of a customer service that they will offer that your big box stores just can't, and a good reason to buy from them, I guess.
Great. We had another person ask, will you be sharing your plant list? I think they are referring to the list of plants you have in your own yard.
This
And
one right
also,
here. You can't see
oh,
it.
we
Hang
can
on.
see
Yeah, get it over here on the screen.
that one.
Yes.
Exactly. I think that's
if they tell me they want the planting plan, I will be happy to send that to them. It's not on my standard handout. So just make sure you tell me that you want the plan, and I'll just, and again, it's ever evolving, but I'll be happy to share it.
great. And then they also wanted to ask, why did you choose to plant more trees?
Well, I had lost trees. And there are many reasons why I chose to plant more trees. Number one, we need more trees. Since the industrial age started in the United States in the early 1800s, we've cut down half of our forests. Now, these old growth forests were huge sequesterers of carbon dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas. In Wichita, we started Wichita in the 1800s. It was a short grass prairie. There were no trees except along the river. But then we came in and paved roads, built brick homes. We created heat islands where the temperature was anywhere from 4 to 10 degrees hotter than farmland outside town. And the only way to cool things off was the shade from trees. And if I didn't continue to plant trees, eventually there wouldn't be any. So, there were just a ton of reasons. Number one, the temperature moderation. Trees also reduce the effects of drought, unless there is so little moisture that they die because of it. But in general, they're beneficial in that. So the more research I did on trees, the more I discovered that trees are an extraordinarily inexpensive and easy way to benefit your environment. Study after study after study has shown that if you'll plant trees strategically around your house so that you take advantage of shade in the summertime and sun in the wintertime by using deciduous trees that lose their leaves, you can save 20% on your energy bills. Now, that seems like a pretty easy thing to do to save money. You know, it's didn't have to work at it very hard to make that happen. So trees are important to me in the landscape. I hope that helped answer that.
Yeah. One person asked, who do we email for the list? If you want to bring that slide back up for
Yep,
them.
I was just going to try to
Yeah.
put that back up there so that they can see it again. I kind of went backwards on it and just shut everything down. So give me a second. This is the aster. The fall blooming aster was that blue one on the left that everybody ought to have somewhere. Bear with me, we're getting there. There it is, right there. Barney@barnh.com.
Thank you. Okay, there was another question. You mentioned dealing with and removing invasive plants. My house has a mature tree of heaven in the backyard, and I've got a significant infestation developing around it, especially along my fence lines. Are there
Cut
any
it down.
methods for removing it that work well in this area?
Chainsaw. Chainsaw. And you're going to have to, unfortunately, the tree of heaven is one of those that will come up from the roots. Any little root that's left, you're going to have to resort to some chemical herbicide to kill it. So, and I would get a hold of the Extension Service and see what their expectation or what their recommendation for the chemical is, because unfortunately I am a Luddite and I will tell you the brand name, which we're not supposed to do. But yeah, it'll be terrible if you, I mean, the other thing that I have done in that you can do depending upon how big the tree is, I have girdled some of the smaller trees, let's say up to 4 inches in diameter in my yard. And if you girdle them, what you basically do is you cut the bark off in about a 1-inch band all the way around the tree, and it prevents any nutrients from flowing up into the canopy, and the tree will die. And when the tree dies that way, then it will also kill the roots. So that's an easy way to do it, I guess, without resorting to chemical warfare. But yeah, they can be a problem.
Those are all the questions we have in chat at this point.
Well, that's not bad. We only have about 10 minutes left. So let me talk about the little, the red flowering plant on the left.
Sounds good.
On this picture. That is bee balm, Monarda didyma, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And that is a hummingbird magnet, in case anybody wants to know. Its big drawback is that it gets powdery mildew. And so this is one of those where if you buy this plant, don't worry so much about the native, buy it for mildew resistance and just feed the hummingbirds. So, okay, well, that took a minute. Now, the tree on this picture on the far right is a red oak. It's probably the largest red oak in Wichita. My wife and I have to join hands to get our arms around it. It shades the entire area. Gorgeous, gorgeous fall color. Probably 100 years old. I like to say it's my tree, but it's not. It's been owned by several people and will be owned by more after me. But, you know, the shade that you get from trees is just irreplaceable in Kansas. Have we got more questions popping up as people think?
We do. Well, one person asked, what's the white multi-flower?
That is a Verburnum. That is rusty Blackhaw Verburnum. Verburnums are an extraordinarily versatile native group of shrubs. They love the shade. They tolerate the drought. They grow in partial sun. They bloom in the spring, and most of them have these round umbral flower heads on them. There is one non-native that I tolerate called Korean Spice, and its redeeming feature is that it is extraordinarily fragrant. Again, take no care. And I'm big into things that don't take any work.
Another person asked, how did you get rid of the honeysuckle and Euonymus? And do you know how to get rid of invasive common ivy?
The Euonymus I have not gotten rid of yet because there is so much Euonymus in our neighborhood that it gets reseeded all the time. I have sprayed I spray it almost every other year, and it keeps it from going wild. I dig it. It's horrible. And then the next one was, what was the next plant?
Honeysuckle. How do you get rid of honeysuckle?
The neat thing about honeysuckle is it's extraordinarily shallow rooted, and I just go around every spring and pull it out. And I have to do that every spring because I've got neighbors that have an entire hedgerow of it. So I'm never going to be without it. It is so established in my neighborhood that, and the birds love the berries and they're going to reseed it. And so I just have these honeysuckle trips where I go out in the yard and walk it. And when I see a seedling, I jerk it out. But if I've missed one and it got, 2 or 3 feet tall, it's not a big deal. You just yank them out.
And then the third one was, how do you get rid of invasive common ivy?
Dig. Now, I have found most of those creeping ground covers very difficult to eradicate with chemicals. I don't know if it's because they have such a waxy finish on their leaf, but the only way that I've been able to get rid of it reliably is to dig it out. And if you dig it out, the nice thing about ivy is that it does not seem to have foreign seeds come in to propagate it like the Euonymus does. So once you kind of get it out of an area, it seems to be gone.
Great. Okay, next question. Will the powdery mildew harm any other plants around it? They have 2 hummingbird families in their yard now.
The powdery mildew, there are plants that are susceptible to it. A common plant in our area is peonies are susceptible to it. But peonies and the bee balm are the only thing that I've seen that are affected by it. In my garden, it is a fungus. It does not seem to affect the hummingbirds, and because they've got resistant species now that they've developed, hybridized, it's much less of a problem for me. So again, if I wanted that, and I wasn't in full sun, then I would buy a native R and just say, well, the butterflies are going to lose a little, 2-foot square ground. There is a native that is a lavender color that grows in full sun. And if you go down to Bartlett Arboretum, they have it out in their prairie, but it's not suitable for my yard because I have too much shade.
Okay. After seeing your beautiful garden, I assume bee balm will grow in the shade. Does it need protection from the wind?
Well, I can't answer that, because the one fortunate thing that I have about my garden is that because we're on the river, we're in a little low valley, and the only way I know if it's windy out is to look at the top of my trees. I like to plant it in this planting that you see here, which is by a little water feature. And I'm gonna plug water features too for a second. But this little area gets sunlight until about for maybe 4 hours a day, and then it's in the shade. But it's protected from the wind, and unless we get wind over 25 miles an hour, I rarely have it at ground level in my lawn, because we're in this little hollow area. It just goes across the top. It's a unique microclimate here. I will tell you that there's another native species you can plant that does well, that attracts hummingbirds, and that is our American honeysuckle, the red form called Major Wheeler. And it's native, it's not invasive. And I think that if you're looking for non-invasive plants, it's really inspiring that you begin to look and you say, many of the plants that people have brought in because they're prettier. Let me find my slide if I can, if we've got a couple more minutes. Oh, here we go. This is a small, go back to it, the purple plant on the right. That's an American wisteria. Now, there are two native forms of wisteria that are available that are not invasive. This is called Amethyst Falls. The flower clusters are smaller. It's not particularly fragrant. It's kind of pretty. And it's a nice vine. There's another one that I like better that's called Kentucky wisteria. The variety is Blue Moon. It's much closer in flower form to the Chinese or Asian wisteria that is just, will grow 50 feet tall and, sprout from the roots in the size of a football field over time. So I find it interesting that we are so obsessed with ultimate beauty that we overlook many of these native plants. Well, it's just like the Carolina allspice in the middle. That's an extraordinarily beautiful flower, and you rarely see it. I think I happened to find one year at Treetop, which is where that one came from. Top plant again is another form of Verburnum, and I'm not sure which one that is.
Okay.
So I've learned a lot on the research trail.
Looks like our next question is, we put in a shade garden this spring with hostas, saxifrage, and lily of the valley. It's mostly even with light, moisture, etc., but the north half is doing well, whereas the south is weak and some of the plants are dying. Do we need to look at a possible soil problem or any other suggestions?
Well, I would always recommend a soil test. The other thing that I would do is I would look at what other factors might be affecting that southern edge. It could be marginally more sunshine. It could also be marginally less irrigation. The plants that I know, lily of the valley and the saxifrage, and what was the first plant on their list?
Hostas?
Hostas all enjoy a certain amount of moisture. I have hostas. I started out with hostas because of the shade, and I didn't bother to dig them out. And I have a lot of variability depending upon where they are in my yard. Those that get pretty much full shade or dappled shade all day do much better than those that get 1 or 2 hours of direct sun. It's just amazing on your hostas what can what can hurt them. The lily of the valley that I have is in full shade all day, but it suffers from drought.
Okay. Next person asked, I love honeysuckle. Are there different kinds?
There are, but most of the ones that are not native are highly invasive. And unfortunately, the ones that we remember as a child, where we would pick the flower and, taste the nectar, those are extraordinarily invasive. It's not a native. So if you love honeysuckle, the question that I would have to ask you is, do you like it for its fragrance, for the vine? What attributes do you really like? Because there are many clematis that you can plant that after they get established are just outstandingly spectacular vines. I have a couple in my yard that climb up a couple of posts that I planted. They reach about 9 feet in height, and they are like a cylinder of flowers. They're a little bit tricky. You'd like to plant them with their roots in the shade and their tops in the sun. But I find them to be another alternative to honeysuckle. The major wheeler is a red form of American honeysuckle, and then there is also an orange form. But those are the only two American honeysuckles that I'm familiar with. The one that I remember as a child is invasive, and you can go into Missouri, and it's almost like kudzu in Alabama. It's just everywhere.
Okay, it looks like we have one last question. What is the name of the wisteria that has blue moon?
Blue moon is called, its common name is Kentucky wisteria. And let's see how quick I can find the scientific name. I actually bought mine at a native plant nursery in Nashville. And the only other way okay, so here we go. It is available by mail order. Monrovia also sells one. Let's see, it's called Wisteria macrostachya is the Latin name, if you want to make sure you get that variety. I will add the website where I have the picture and the description of that to my resource list so that everybody can have that if they request it. And it really is much, much prettier than the Amethyst Falls. Okay.
Okay, it looks like we had one more question come into the chat.
I'll keep answering.
Okay. I have a sky pencil Japanese holly tree and it's starting to turn brown. Is it possible to get too much sun, or how do I go about identifying what's causing this?
I planted 4 of those, and they do like the shade. I don't think they tolerate the drought very well. I do not find them vigorous at all, and I'm on the verge of just yanking them out. There is a yew that I have planted. It's Irish yew or English yew. It's Taxus fastigiata. The fastigiata means a towering form. That is a far superior plant, but you can't find it. The 2 that I have I got the last two that Hillside had maybe 4 years ago, not Hillside, but Treetop had maybe 4 years ago, and they can't even get it anymore. So uh, I wish there were a better alternative, because the sky pencil holly is a very pretty shrub, and there's a lot of places where these narrow columnar plants would do well. But boy, we're limited here in our climate.